David Koffman, welcome to the Honest Report podcast.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
The pleasure is all ours. So, of course, we just had Jewish Heritage Month wrapped up. This seems like an opportune time, of course, to talk about really the history of the Jewish community in this country. Tell us a little bit about how that started. Draw us a picture, how the first Jews in this country really came to be.
Well, the history of this community is actually pretty old. Indeed, Jews first started arriving in the 1750s, possibly the 1740s, of individual Jews arriving, which was, of course, 120 years or 130 years before Canada became a country at all. So Jews predate Canada in the place that's now Canada. They came to the British colonies, which were here and in what became the United States as well as other colonies in the Caribbean and all up and down the Atlantic coast. These Jews were part of what they called an Atlantic triangular trade world. So they helped move all kinds of commodities from the European continent to the New World, and then from there on ships to Africa, and then from Africa back to Europe, and sometimes in other directions, where they moved all sorts of goods around what was sort of the globalized world of the 18th century. And Jews that arrived in the colonies, including the ones that would become Canada, were mostly involved in fur and the incredible fur business that compelled and propelled the development of Canada as a country. So Jews were basically here from the very start of the saga that would become Canada.
So, how many people were in Canada at that time? Where did these Jews first come from?
Well, there's some debate about where these Jews first came from. According to the research of a scholar named Sheldon Godfrey and his wife Judy Godfrey, they did really the most important spate work on digging up the actual documentation from the 1700s. We think they probably came from Bohemia, which is in current day Czechoslovakia, because of the particular dialect of Yiddish that they spoke, that they left records in. They came, via England and were involved in this global triangular trade life. So they may have had family that was in England or in Holland. They may have had family in the Caribbean or in South America in the British or Dutch colonies, and were part of this sort of big network of traders. There were probably maybe 20 or 30 families that had arrived by, say, the 1770s. A trickle of individuals who may have come and then left or moved and migrated to other colonies or back to the European continent. But the actual established community, I'd say, was established already in, let's say, the 1760s when they founded Shearith Israel, the first congregation that's in Montreal, that's still around. But they also lived in Trois-Rivières, in other parts of the St. Lawrence Seaway, Michilimackinac, and other places, and were again part of this fur trader merchant world.
What was the next stage after that? When did the community really start to become a community as opposed to just an individual groups of Jewish traders?
So you had like a few hundred people that were part of rural and urban worlds in the 1700s, and in the early 1800s. There were roughly 2,500 Jews in Canada by the early 1880s. So after Confederation, 1867, maybe 2,500, some in Victoria, some in Montreal, some in Toronto, and some spread out in some of the rural places. And then over the next 20 years, the population went from maybe 2,500 to maybe 16,000. So pretty significant growth of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. They were from the Russian Empire, from other parts of the Eastern Europe, the other Eastern European empires, and they came to Canada basically as economic refugees and also as people that were fleeing violence and the threat of violence in Eastern Europe. So these were the, big first wave of mass migration of Jews that made it to Canada.
And what were some of the professions that these Jews had? Of course, they weren't so much in the cities, as I understand. There was some of this migration, and you've depicted some of that. But tell us, what were they doing there?
So there were Jews that were like some Jews who migrated and formed ethnic enclaves, pretty dense Jewish neighborhoods in communities in Montreal, in Winnipeg, and Toronto are the three biggest ones. But you're right, there were tons of Jews that made it to small towns. There was an entire movement of agricultural colonies in the Canadian prairies, something like 180, I don't remember the exact number, but a significant number of agricultural colonies where Jews were, kind of pushed, not pushed, they were invited and then welcomed and given land to settle the West along the prairies as part of Canada's effort to develop the prairies and make kind of connect the West to the center and the east of the country and make a country through settlement. Those agricultural colonies are really fascinating. Jewish agricultural colonies, sets of 20 or 30 families that lived for two, sometimes three generations on these farms. And then there were lots of Jews who made it to very small towns as peddlers, as small time entrepreneurs who went door to door, farm to farm, selling fancy goods and small practical items to people, often on credit, and had all kinds of relationships with all of the various sorts of non-Jews that were settling Canada at the time. And some of those people opened up shops instead of going door to door to do the sales. They would open up kind of general stores, and people would come and buy their foodstuffs or their dry goods or things like that from this kind of proto department store. Some of those expanded and became these larger department stores, and many of them lasted deep into the 20th century in small town Canadian life. But lots of people over the course of the 20th century left these smaller towns to join Jewish communities in larger cities where there were better business opportunities, there was better opportunities to find a Jewish mate, to be part of Jewish communities, organized Jewish communities, synagogue communities. And so the rural trend, it was an urbanization trend basically over the course of the mid 20th century. By the First World War, the number of Jews went from that 15, 16,000 people I was talking about in 1900. So just 15 years later, there were 100,000 Jews. So the growth was absolutely massive and was mainly focused in the metropolises. But again, there's this really interesting small town and very much rural experience as well. That's just part of our history.
I think a lot of people today would take somewhat for granted that you have a Jewish community that is very involved and integrated into pretty much every facet of Canadian life, but it wasn't always like that. You had these immigrants who were coming over. They faced a lot of institutional anti-Semitism, English barriers, and so on. So how did that morph really from this kind of alienated community to the very integrated one that we have today?
Well, it grew. It grew by the sweat of its own brow. Let's put it that way. There was a period from the 1920s, basically through the end of the Second World War, where there was very, very little new Jewish immigration because of xenophobic and nativistic anti-immigration policy that partly targeted Jews and others. So for the people who were here from the 20s already, they did experience a pretty rough chapter of anti-Semitic activity in the 30s and 40s, but they were meanwhile acculturating. They were becoming much more Canadian. Their English got better. They saved capital. They built businesses. They went into the professions the generation after that, and they used the courts to advocate for fair policies in terms of hiring, in terms of housing, in terms of a host of other what we now call human rights issues. So they use the tools of the state and of governance themselves to make Canada more inclusive and welcoming, and they worked their butts off. They valued education, as you know, so their children went to universities as first generation university students in the 30s and more so in the 40s and 50s, and they became professionals. They continued on with family businesses, but also joined the ranks of the white collar professions and worked hard to integrate themselves into a Canada that was sometimes hostile and sometimes welcoming, depending on exactly where and when. There was certainly anti-Semitic challenges and barriers, but those lessened over time, particularly through the 80s and 90s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when multiculturalism took hold in Canada. And by that time, there were so many new immigrants that came from the global south or from much farther afield from Western and Central and Southern and Eastern Europe, that the new immigrants looked a lot more different to the Protestant white Canadian mainstream than did the Jewish difference. So whereas at the turn of the century, Jews were a really prominent minority, they were poor, they were Yiddish speaking, they looked different, they had different customs, they were non-Christian. Jews were really sort of the test case for how well and how much Canadian local communities and provincial, municipal, and federal governments kind of took to diversity. And by the time Jews were sort of well integrated into Canadian life, there was a lot more diversity, and Jews looked a lot less different to their Christian neighbors than did some of the newer immigrants.
As I mentioned, I think it would help us understand a little bit more in terms of how the Jewish community got to the point that it is today. Can you help explain to us the level of contributions and the type of contributions that the Jewish community has made in this country?
Well, let me say it this way. Integration and contributions are both different questions. They're both very excellent and very fascinating questions, and there are long answers to both. I'll try to give short answers. The short answer for the integration, I like to see it on two dimensions. There's a vertical integration and there's horizontal integration. So what I mean by that, vertical is about how well taken care of and considered are Jewish concerns with political elites of various sorts. The police chief, the president of the university, the mayor of the town, the premier, the federal ministers, the prime minister itself. Him or herself. And in all of those sort of vertical connections, Jews now and for quite a long time, at least 40 years, are very well integrated. Jewish concerns are taken seriously by political leaders of all sorts. We've cultivated our vertical relationships quite well. Horizontally, right now, we're feeling very challenged about whether different kinds of minority groups, people that may have used to be allies or people that didn't have Jews on the radar, whether or not they're allies laterally. But we are, by point of fact, very well integrated Canadians in the sense that we don't face any what they call systemic barriers to getting government funding or bank loans or having access to public education or access to health. Like we do what Canadians of similar economic status do, meaning we participate in Canadian life in all kinds of rich ways, from voting to dealing with different kinds of authorities and the courts, and we get sort of fair treatment institutionally in all these places. We're not discriminated against on a kind of systemic level. So the integration question may also be answered in terms of intermarriage. So sometimes Jewish community leaders or people in the Jewish community think about intermarriage as a problem because we're losing Jews, but you may also think about it as a barometer for how willing are non-Jewish Canadians to marry and integrate with Jews. It's not a problem to marry a Jew. It's a sign of well integration that we have high intermarriage rates, even though from a certain Jewish community point of view, that's bad for the Jewish community. So it depends on kind of how you look at it. Your second question was about contributions. And here, I mean, the contributions that Jews have made to this country are just legion. I mean, they're in the sciences and in literature and culture, in business, in philanthropy, in politics, in terms of public life and communal life. Jews have just played an absolutely extraordinary role in this country's legal development, in its medical advances, and many other spheres. So yeah, I mean we've done pretty great by this country, and I think that most Jews recognize this. And then there's a question as to how and to what extent do non-Jews recognize this, and That's a matter of how the history is retold or remediated to public and who knows what and under what conditions. And that's an interesting thing for us to tackle.
David, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Tremendously appreciated.
My pleasure. My pleasure.